Madison Square Garden, September 12, 1946. 20,000 people filled every seat, packed the aisles, pressed against the walls. They'd come to hear Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Commerce, deliver what they thought would be a routine political speech. Instead, they were about to witness the opening salvo in a battle that would nearly destroy Harry Truman's presidency. Wallace stepped to the podium holding pages that would trigger a constitutional crisis within hours. He looked out at the crowd and began speaking words that directly contradicted everything his own president was trying to accomplish in foreign policy. Getting tough never brought anything real and lasting, Wallace declared. Whether for schoolyard bullies or businessmen or world powers, the tougher we get, the tougher the Russians will get. 3,000 miles away in Paris, Secretary of State James Berners was negotiating with Allied diplomats who now had absolutely no idea what American foreign policy actually was. Harry Truman was about to discover that the man he'd thought was a loyal cabinet member had been working to undermine him from the very beginning. To understand why Henry Wallace tried to destroy Truman's presidency, you need to understand how close Wallace came to becoming president himself. July 1944. Everyone who saw Franklin Roosevelt understood he was dying. The man looked grey, exhausted, struggling through meetings. His fourth-term vice president would almost certainly become president. Henry Wallace had served as Roosevelt's vice president since 1941. Gallup polls showed 65% of Democratic delegates supported his renomination. The eventual winner, Harry Truman, polled at 2%. But Wallace had accumulated powerful enemies who believed he was too liberal and far too sympathetic to the Soviet Union. A group of Democratic Party bosses decided Wallace had to go. They called themselves the Conspiracy of the Pure in Heart. These men saw Wallace as genuinely dangerous. He openly denounced racial segregation at a time when the Democratic Party depended on Southern votes. His statements about the Soviet Union suggested he would abandon America's allies to appease Stalin. They convinced Roosevelt to sign a letter expressing support for either Truman or Supreme Court Justice William Douglas instead of Wallace. July 20, 1944. The Democratic National Convention descended into chaos. Wallace's supporters flooded the Chicago Stadium, chanting his name, demanding an immediate vote that night. Senator Claude Pepper of Florida later wrote that he was convinced Wallace would win if voting happened immediately. Pepper rushed toward the podium to place Wallace's name into nomination. He never made it. Samuel Jackson, the session chair, had strict instructions from party chairman Robert Hannigan: do not let the convention nominate the vice president tonight. Jackson slammed his gavel and adjourned the session before Pepper could speak. While Wallace sat in his hotel room, refusing to campaign for himself, party bosses worked through the night making deals. The next morning, Truman won with 310 votes to Wallace's 105. Jackson later said he wanted his tombstone to read, "Here lies the man who stopped Henry Wallace from becoming President of the United States." Franklin Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, exactly 82 days after Harry Truman was inaugurated as vice president. If the convention had voted the night Wallace's supporters wanted, Henry Wallace would have become President of the United States. Roosevelt had given Wallace a consolation prize for losing the vice presidency. He made Wallace Secretary of Commerce in January 1945. It was supposed to keep Wallace quiet and occupied. It didn't work. Wallace saw the appointment as confirmation that Roosevelt had always preferred him over Truman. He believed he was the rightful heir to FDR's legacy and everything it represented. And he was determined to prove it by demonstrating that Truman's approach to the Soviet Union was catastrophically wrong. Truman saw Stalin as a ruthless dictator who understood only strength. His policy of containment aimed to stop Soviet expansion through economic aid, military alliances, and strategic pressure. Wallace saw the world completely differently. He believed the Soviet Union's aggressive behavior stemmed from legitimate security fears. Russia had lost tens of millions of people in 2 world wars fought on its soil. If America showed trust and understanding, Wallace argued, Stalin would reciprocate with cooperation. These weren't just policy disagreements between cabinet members. These were incompatible worldviews being debated inside the same administration. And Wallace decided to force the issue publicly. Wallace wrote a speech directly challenging Truman's foreign policy and asked the president to review it before delivery. What happened next became one of the great controversies of the Truman administration. Truman later claimed Wallace asked for only 15 minutes of his time, but the speech took 30 minutes to read aloud. Truman was running behind schedule for other appointments. When reporters asked afterward if he'd approved Wallace's speech, Truman said yes. He meant he'd approved Wallace's right to deliver it, not the content. The press interpreted it as approval of the policy itself. The speech at Madison Square Garden created immediate chaos. Secretary of State Bernays sent an ultimatum from Paris. Either Wallace goes or I go. You cannot have your Secretary of State and Secretary of Commerce publicly advocating opposite foreign policies. On September 20, 1946, Truman asked for Wallace's resignation. Truman's private diary reveals his true feelings about the incident. I'm very much afraid Henry is not only fuzzy, but that he has absorbed some of the commie thinking. In 1948, Henry Wallace announced he would run for president on a third-party ticket. The Progressive Party platform was ambitious: desegregation, national health insurance, peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. But something was happening behind the scenes that Wallace either didn't notice or didn't want to acknowledge. His campaign was being infiltrated by people who answered to Moscow. The American Communist Party threw its full support behind Wallace. They were well organized and highly disciplined, and they quickly took control of key positions within the Progressive Party structure. Wallace's campaign manager, C.B. Baldwin, was a Communist Party member. So was his wife. So were his top speechwriters. Some, like economist Victor Perlow, had previously passed government secrets to Soviet intelligence. In March 1948, Henry Wallace made a decision that crossed a line no American presidential candidate had ever crossed before. He began secret communications with the Soviet government. According to documents discovered decades later in Russian archives, Wallace made contact with Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet ambassador to the United Nations. He used the Czech UN ambassador as an intermediary to arrange the meetings. Wallace met privately with Gromyko at least 3 times. At the first meeting, he shocked the Soviet diplomat with an extraordinary proposal. Wallace wanted to travel to Moscow and negotiate directly with Stalin. If elected president, Wallace promised, he would end the Cold War immediately. Gromyko asked what terms Wallace wanted for such negotiations. Wallace's answer was stunning. He didn't care. He would accept whatever Stalin wanted. Stalin decided not to risk having Wallace visit Moscow. The diplomatic complications would be enormous, but the Soviet dictator saw an opportunity. He offered to help Wallace craft a public statement calling for peace between the superpowers. They would coordinate their messaging to create the appearance of diplomatic breakthrough. On May 11, 1948, Henry Wallace stood before 19,000 people at Madison Square Garden and read his open letter to Stalin calling for peaceful cooperation. 1 week later, Stalin issued his official endorsement, praising Wallace's letter as the most important political document of recent times. The two men had coordinated their statements like actors performing a scripted play. What Wallace had done was almost certainly illegal under the Logan Act of 1799, which prohibits private citizens from negotiating with foreign governments in disputes with the United States. But prosecution would have made Wallace a martyr and given him exactly the attention he wanted. Truman decided to let voters render their verdict instead. Election Day, 1948. Delivered multiple surprises. Harry Truman defeated Thomas Dewey in one of the greatest upsets in American political history. But the bigger story for Henry Wallace was his own humiliating defeat. Wallace didn't finish third, he finished fourth. The segregationist Dixiecrat candidate Strom Thurmond received more votes than the man who had almost been president 4 years earlier. Wallace received about 1.1 million votes, roughly 2.4% of the total. He failed to win a single state. The American people had rendered their judgment on his vision of accommodation with Stalin. The years after 1948 brought events that forced Wallace to reconsider everything he believed. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, ending America's nuclear monopoly. In 1950, Communist North Korea invaded South Korea with Soviet weapons and Stalin's explicit blessing. Wallace watched as the dictator he had trusted revealed his true nature through actions that couldn't be explained away. In August 1950, Wallace resigned from the Progressive Party and announced his support for American military intervention in Korea. The transformation was stunning. The man who had secretly colluded with Stalin now supported fighting Stalin's allies with American troops. In 1952, Henry Wallace published an article in a major magazine that shocked his former supporters. The title said, "Everything Where I Was Wrong." Wallace admitted he had fundamentally misjudged Soviet intentions. He had believed Stalin wanted peace and cooperation. He had been deceived. The Soviet Union, Wallace now declared, was utterly evil. The man Wallace had tried to destroy, Harry Truman, had been right all along. 4 years later, in 1956, Wallace endorsed Dwight Eisenhower for president. His political journey had come full circle from progressive champion to supporting a Republican former general. Harry Truman lived until 1972, long enough to see his reputation completely rehabilitated. The policies Wallace had opposed became the foundation of Western victory in the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO. These were the building blocks that contained Soviet expansion and ultimately won the Cold War without firing a shot. Wallace lived until 1965, spending his final years on a farm in upstate New York, far from the political stage. Politics had not been kind to him in the end. The story of Wallace and Truman reveals something important about presidential transitions and the dangers of personal resentment. Wallace never accepted that Truman legitimately held the office Wallace believed should have been his by right. That resentment drove him to actions that came dangerously close to treason. What would have happened if Wallace had become president instead of Truman? Based on Soviet archives opened after the Cold War, there would still have been a Cold War. Stalin didn't want peace or cooperation. He wanted American passivity that would let him expand Soviet control without opposition. A President Wallace would have given him that passivity. No Marshall Plan rebuilding Europe. No NATO protecting Western democracies. No Berlin airlift breaking the Soviet blockade. Soviet domination of not just Eastern Europe, but potentially Western Europe as well. Wallace himself eventually admitted this reality. The man he had trusted had never been trustworthy. The dictator he had wanted to negotiate with had only wanted weakness he could exploit. Truman understood something Wallace didn't learn until it was too late. Some adversaries cannot be appeased or reasoned with. They must be contained through strength. Henry Wallace tried to destroy Truman's presidency because he believed Truman was fundamentally wrong about the Soviet Union and the nature of the post-war world. History proved that Truman was right, and Wallace, to his credit, eventually had the honesty to admit it.